for many, many reasons, especially the enormous variations, not only in kind of pathologies, but bodies too. I guess I wanted to say that I really don't have anything, I don't think, in principle against the use of kind of artificial intelligence in medicine. But we definitely need to address kind of important questions around data bias. And also we need to talk about how humans and machines might kind of work together in the delivery of improved care. It's very much pitched like human versus AI at the moment, but of course there's a place for both. And it's urgent because there is a billions of dollars worth of new AI software for this medical image analysis in the pipeline. I was reading a trade journal recently, and a prominent radiologist wrote that the hustle to get access to medical image data and make it exclusive and proprietary reminds me of the gold rush 2 centuries ago. I guess, so yeah, I don't want to get too heavy on this, I'll skip a bit of the talk, but you know, one of the issues is that the ethical and privacy frameworks are kind of lagging behind advances in the use of artificial intelligence. And we're all part of this. So the question of whose body? Well, everybody's body, right? There's increasing numbers of data sharing agreements between healthcare trusts and software companies for research, for machine learning. So it's interesting, in the UK, the General Medical Council's guidelines allow ethics committees to agree to research that retrospectively uses anonymized data without explicit patient consent. So I'm not saying that that's unethical or that something unethical is taking place, because obviously health providers go to extreme lengths. You know, we have very robust regulatory frameworks to protect patient privacy and confidentiality. I'm just interested. I don't think the kind of separation of the image from the patient is a kind of secure thing. And, you know, we're seeing a kind of new image economy, if you like, and the commodification of patient data on a kind of unprecedented scale. So my speculative kind of feeling about this is that actually the internal body itself is becoming vulnerable to new forms of kind of calculation and speculation, not just clinical, financial is what I'm saying. And so the relationship between the inside and the outside of the body, which was previously mediated through the clinic, is like increasingly vulnerable to being mediated through the free market. That's my contentious position on all this, which of course is quite speculative, but thank you.
That's okay. I mean,
the film, yeah.
I mean, I think you do. I think that does speak actually very strongly to the issues in the film.
Okay,
just you don't talk about it explicitly.
directly.
I think, I think there's a lot of links there. Okay, so our next speaker in this smorgasbord of different opinions is Ian Berle. Ian Berle was head of medical illustration for a great many years at the Royal London Hospital and St Bart's. He's the specialist assessor for the legal, ethical and copyright module of Staffordshire University's Medical Illustration Certificate and Diploma course. He has postgraduate degrees in bioethics as well as in privacy law. So, you know, we have thought about the links here. And has written a thesis on face recognition technology and its effect on privacy and confidentiality. Ian's recent work concerns how the right to one's own image might be adequately protected, and he has a forthcoming book, plug alert, based on his thesis, which will discuss the issues from his thesis. So, over to
Thank you. It's very unusual for a photographer not to show images, but I don't work in a department any longer, and I wouldn't have been able to get permission to show any images. So it's going to be text-based, and I hope this will try to bring some of the strands, and I must keep an eye on the time as well, some of the strands together. And what we've heard so far is some very good examples of what Michel Foucault called the clinical gaze. Everyone is curious. Rodigan wanted to see what his machine would do in 1895. Now, where would we be without him? We wouldn't be having a meeting like this. So everyone is interested in the clinical gaze. I would say that you wouldn't be here if you weren't. Okay, now, let's have a look at what the differences are between clinical photography, and I've summarized them. And these are really only headlines. Each one of these represents a lecture program in itself. Okay, and I'm not busking for any of that. So clinical photography, and what I've done is you'll see two columns, and I'll go through these headlines as quickly and as clearly as possible. Clinical photography is representational. When a photographer wants to become a clinical photographer, they have to demonstrate their skills in what's known as standardized representational photography. It is patient-centered. It's only about the patient. It's representational because it represents the condition that that patient presents with. It's standardized because it has to be repeated. So in a treatment program, you would have to have the same position in the lighting, the same magnification ratio, even the same background, same setup, absolutely spot on, so that a department that has 2 or 3 photographers wouldn't necessarily have the same photographer photographing the patient. So each photographer follows each other's work and duplicates or replicates the treatment program progress as it goes. That's why SRP, as it's known, is essential. It's also consented. We heard how long it took Liz to get consent. Well, consent in a hospital department is done at the time of the consultation with the doctor, who then refers the patient to the photographer. The photographer then checks the consent and that the patient has understood what the photography involves, hence the term informed consent. Now, looking at medical art, it's only representative. You wouldn't have an artist drawing every patient. And an anatomical drawing is an anatomical drawing. It's anonymous, it represents a human body. However, medical art falls into an area of whose interests, who asks for the drawing to be done, whose interests are being served. The photography is patient-centered. It's only about the patient. Secondary uses might be teaching, it might be publication, but at the end, the primary or principal purpose of the photography is just for the patient record. So it's consented and it's confidential. It has to be repeatable. Now, moving down that list, a medical artist will be illustrating something, maybe simplifying something that a photograph cannot do. If I were to photograph, and I've done many a time, photographed an open abdomen in an operating theatre, there's a lot of stuff inside once you make an incision. You get a lot of blood. And okay, it can look pretty gory. But an artist can separate out the anatomy and demonstrate what the doctor, what the surgeon wants to see. All that the photographer is doing in the theatre is getting a record of what is found at that surgery. So it becomes documentary. Medical art is arguably complementary. It complements what the photographer can see and what the surgeon or doctor wants to illustrate. The photograph is indexical, meaning it's only related to that person. Medical art is emblematic. It's a symbol of what is seen. We look round. A good example of that is that ceramic of what could only be called a chest cavity, but it doesn't represent your lungs. That is not that's not an artist's impression of a radiological image that we saw that Professor Strickland showed. And I would call that a derivative. Not in any sense a derogatory way, but it's a way of interpreting in an artistic form what your chest cavity might look like. So it's emblematic. Now, what's interesting is that both photography and art is copyrighted. However, photographers who work in a hospital are not the copyright owner. The NHS Trust is the copyright owner. The artist, on the other hand, is the copyright owner and would license that copyright, if I've understood this right, to the person who's commissioned the work. The copyright is still held by the artist. One is also a medical record, another is abstract. The body print out there is not a medical record. It's an abstract of a body. So how does this all go together? Now, we talked about consent. Now, there is this thing called GDPR. Some of us might have been involved in trying to get our organisations to be compliant. Well, in 2018, it was taken into British law, UK law, and it's called the Data Protection Act 2018. And it has all sorts of caveats, clauses about consent, what you can do with the material, and so on. And it even has in Article 9 something about biometrics and AI and what you can or cannot do. Medical art, on the other hand, is subject to the Copyright Design and Patents Act, 1988. It may not have anything to do with data. A lot of the material on display would come under the Copyright Act, not the Data Protection Act, because it's anonymous, it's unknown, it's emblematic, and not indexical. So, just in summarising some of this, whose body? Well, we heard it's everybody's body. It's your and mine, yours and my body. But in clinical photography, it's a known body. It's a living body, generally. If a clinical photographer photographs someone who isn't living, that's forensic photography. It is also personal because it relates to the patient, you and me. It is also supportive because it can help treatment progress and follow that process through. It helps well-being if the photography is done for various specialties. Medical art is often done with subjects who are unknown. Often, in terms of anatomical drawings and art, it's cadaveric, not forensic, cadaveric. It's derived and it's impersonal. But one of the most fascinating and interesting things that I came across in my career was when Mark Gilbert started to work for Ian Hutchinson, doing the painting that series of pictures of Ian Hutchinson's patients, which were then turned into portraits called Saving Faces. And they had an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery about 15 years ago. It's still online. It's worth a look. So medical art can be affirming because people who were sitting for Mark were people who might have been ignored. And yet Mark's art dignifies those people, those patients. So, in closing, I would suggest, if you want to dig a little deeper, Cecil Faber's Whose Body Is It Anyway? Justice and Integrity of the Person is a very interesting read. Michel Foucault, Birth of the Clinic, I would say, if you want to get an understanding of the birth of the clinic and what the clinical gaze is, and the history of that, this is essential reading. And then Rohan Hardcastle, who's a solicitor, wrote his book, Law and the Human Body, Property Rights, Ownership and Control. You don't own your organs. And the law's changing about donation and so on, but I don't want to make any comment about that with my bioethics background as well. Okay, and finally, there are some professional resources out there, but there's one that isn't on there that I'll mention. First of all, GMC guidelines would make interesting you reading. making and using visual and audio recordings of patients. And the Institute of Medical Illustrators is a great resource if you want to see how the profession handles all of this kind of material. And if you're interested in AI, a little while ago, the Nuffield Trust set up the Ava Lovelace Institute, and it's looking at AI in all its manifestations. So have a look at their website, the Ava Lovelace Institute. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ian. So our last panellist tonight is Amanda Couch. Amanda is an artist, researcher and senior lecturer at the University for the Creative Arts in Farnham. Her work cuts across media, and her practice and research includes performance, live and recorded image, print and book, sculpture, food, participation, writing, all sorts of things. She has what she calls an ongoing obsession with the digestive system, metaphorically and materially, and how it's employed to explores processing and embodied ways of knowing and becoming. Amanda's work, or two prints from Amanda's series called Liver Models, are included in the exhibition, and I understand that Amanda's going to bring perhaps the non-human into our discussions today in part. So over to Amanda.
Thank you. Hello. So yeah, my work in the show differs, which I understand is that from most of the other work in the exhibition, that it depicts the organs of non-human subjects and those that very much did not give their consent. Part of the series of 12 liver models from 2016, they are a pair of direct prints from the surface of actual livers from two different lambs. The liver models are part of the Exdispicy in the Everyday project, and the series A Woman Holding a Liver, where I performed a contemporary manifestation of the ancient ritual of liver divination. The works draw on the ancient Mesopotamian practice of exdispicy, or divination using the entrails. As Robert Temple writes in Odyssey, the Glaxo Wellcome Journal of Innovation in Healthcare, the ancients were fascinated by the tales that entrails tell, and in which autopsies of animals were used to analyse the health of the environment and predict the future. The liver models were printed by traditional jiataku, the Japanese method of printing fish, a form of nature printing. Developed in the Middle Ages, nature printing could be argued as an early and simple form of scientific imaging, which was used to accurately depict medicinal plants. By the Renaissance, it had become a well-known and well-renowned scientific process of reproducing plants. However, its roots lay in plant printing, but has also been used to reproduce three-dimensional materials such as stones and fish. The liver is a receptive material, like a copper plate treated with a soft ground. Chance forms it. The liver is inscribed by its anatomical neighbours in the belly cavity, which determine the markings that can be seen on the surface. In ancient Mesopotamia, these were known as drawrings, grooves that diviners would have observed, an index of the lamb's life lived. For example, the presence and path are grooves on the Babylonian right lobe formed by the impression of the abomasum, or the fourth stomach, and the throne base is the impression made by the right kidney. These and other markings pointed to the creature's wider environment. Unexpected things come to light from entrails, Temple proposes. Creatures which appear healthy can be seen to be diseased by examining their intestines and livers. The diseases revealed by exdispicy, together with their inauspicious signs, often came from the unwholesomeness of the environment. Nomads, he continues, from very early times used such indicators as cues to move on to healthier pastures. This was animal autopsy used to gauge the environment and make decisions about where to live. My prints appear to be made in an instant when the inky surface meets blank paper, a moment in comparison to the long, meticulously observed draftings of many of the historical and contemporary illustrations in the exhibition. And yes, it is a fairly swift process. Ink is applied to the liver's surface, dabbed off, paper is laid, and a gentle rubbing applied, not a burnishing nor a pressing, but a caress, and then lifted to reveal the imprint. But the development of the plate, of the liver itself, is much longer, etched over many years from birth until death, and is out of my control. The engraving of the liver plate reflects the life of the animal, how it was treated, how it lived, it was cared for, what it ate, its relationships with other animals, humans, insects, parasites, how it was transported for slaughter, how it was killed and butchered, and of course none of this, including being part of my project, the animal had any consent over. Animals have been routinely used to understand the workings of bodies, both human and their own, throughout the history of medicine. The earliest examinations of sacrificial victims in the practice of extispicy, and then later physicians in ancient Greece explored the anatomy of animals for their research. Alcmaeon of Croton in the 5th century BCE employed the dissection of animals, and Galen in the 2nd century performed vivisection, forming the basis of many of his writings, which persisted as canonical, authoritative, and undisputed until the Renaissance. For the ancient Greeks at least, using animals live or otherwise to further human understanding was not a moral concern, adhering to rigorous hierarchy where all living and non-living natural things, from minerals to the gods, were ranked according to their proximity to the divine. Ideas which would endure and underscore the Judeo-Christian worldview of the superiority of humans over nature, which arguably our global environmental crisis is a result of. According to Nuno Henrique Franco, the use of animal experiments to satisfy scientific inquiry would only re-emerge in the Renaissance, with Flemish anatomist Vesalius, who created the foundations of modern comparative anatomy. Arguments during the so-called Age of Enlightenment, despite both failing to deny animal sentience, saw Descartes invoking machinism, a view of animals as soulless, senseless automata, to justify his own vivisections, and philosopher Spinoza writing that we should use animals as we please, treating them in the best way that suits us, for their nature is not like ours. Franco argues that despite this era's initiating the departure from the Christian theocentrism, in this new anthropocentric view, animals continue to have no moral standing on their own. She draws parallels to other oppressive attitudes and behaviours of the period when the slave market thrived and women were seen as inferior. My provocation points to the emerging scene of multi-species studies, which challenges the idea of human supremacism and aims to go beyond viewing other creatures as mere symbols, resources, or backgrounds for the lives of humans. Tom van Doren, Ben Kurtzy, and Ursula Munster write, life cannot arise and be sustained in isolation. Organisms are situated within deep, entangled histories, and so, beyond mere survival, particular lifeways in all their resplendent diversity emerge from interwoven patterns of living and dying, of being and becoming in a larger world. They propose a practice of passionate immersion, which means becoming curious and so entangled, learning to be affected, and so perhaps to understand and care a little differently. And I'd like to conclude by evoking two final kind of points in relation to this. The Great Ape Personhood movement, which aims to extend legal personhood to apes, a distinction that recognises these non-human animals as beings with the capacity to hold both rights and duties. The movement achieved success in 2008 in Spain when the Parliament passed a resolution granting human rights to apes. And in New York in 2015, two chimpanzees, Hercules and Leo, received recognition as legal persons and were granted the right not to be imprisoned against their will. Finally, such successes for the rights of apes highlights what Thelma Rowell, a former primatologist and now sheep observer, calls the failures of ethology, the study of human behaviour, which she states is a hierarchical scandal, in that we have given primates multiple chances, but we know just about nothing about the others, particularly sheep. Rowell states, sheep have an additional difficulty compared to most other animals, particularly farm animals, because they cannot effectively protest. A cow you have to treat with a little more respect because they are bigger than you. With sheep, you can do what you like. They don't make any obvious protest. They just get miserable. In her essay, Do Sheep Have Opinions? Viancien Desprit presents Thelma Rowell's experience with her sheep writing. As the etymology of the word reminds us, to protest means above all to testify, and that is precisely where sheep's problems lie. They have never been able to testify to what interests them, since whatever it is that might interest them has been offered no affordance, no possibility of articulation with what interests those who attest on their behalf. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Am I on? Yes, grand. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. I think some of you might be getting handheld mics because I think some of the radio mics might have given up the ghost. Is that fit? Okay, great, lovely. So there is such a lot of food for thought in this, and I've been scribbling away notes in an effort to try and come up with some kind of key themes that have been discussed and maybe some prompting questions to start the discussion. First of all, I'm bobbling in and out as well, aren't I? How's that? I think we've really dived into some of the multifaceted understandings that we have of the body. Everyone's answered the question of whose body is it in a really different way. We've gone from the very personal experiences that Sophie's talked about through the very clinical aspects and the amazing things that are being done now in clinic, that Nicola, that you've talked about, that you know, the ways we can help the unborn child. But from a very, is this one on instead? Is that better? Yeah, a very clinical perspective to the mechanical and the gold digging perspective on it maybe, through the record keeping, the documentary, the very sort of clinical records aspect of medical photography, to realms beyond the human body that I haven't really considered in the curating the exhibition at all, but open it up in a very wide way. But I guess my first question to the panel, and anyone can leap in on this, is this thinking about this changing ethics across time from the very ancient world to the present day. And it made me think this idea of gold digging that you talked about, Liz, the prospectors, the way that intelligence is now a sort of new field opening up for people to kind of grab this data and make money from it. To what extent do people think that maybe that's partly what was behind Vesalius? Vesalius produces this amazing book of anatomy with these fabulously detailed pictures which show people the body in a way it's never been seen before. It's fabulously important for clinical medicine eventually, but the world of surgery at his time, no one's doing surgery that's detailed enough that those images are going to make much difference. To what extent is that? Can you hear me at all now? Yeah. You can. Am I there? I'm there. To what extent do you think that Vesalius's book is that kind of thing as well? It's kind of making money off the back of exploiting or making the most of pictures of the human body. That's for anyone who has a thought. And if none of you answer, I'll pick one.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, your question really is, are we asking what Vesalius himself intended from it? I must say, I'd always assumed that, that it was the pursuit of knowledge, and not making money out of an exploitation, if you like, of the human body. I mean, I think it is interesting to draw parallels with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is hugely topical in radiology and in imaging. I welcome artificial intelligence, I have to say, with open arms. There are not enough radiologists in the UK. We are hugely understaffed, not because it isn't a massively popular discipline to go into for junior doctors, and we're turning away 4 or 5 junior doctors for every post we have, but because the government won't fund any more training. So we can do with all the help we can get, actually, from machinery, and so I like to think of it as augmented intelligence. And we need the researchers and the vendors and so forth to have access to as much data as possible. Obviously, it's important that those data be anonymized properly so that, you know, patients aren't identified, but it is going to help all of us if those algorithms that are being developed are based on as much clinical data as we can get hold of. But you are right, it is interesting that there is this huge hunger for data amongst the scientists and the computer engineers, and particularly the vendors. And so that is leading to, in some instances, in the UK as well as what we've seen in the USA, financial bids effectively being made to large hospital consortia to pay for access to those data. What is actually tending to happen is that they are being accessed behind hospital firewalls, so the data don't have to be anonymised in that they're not being taken out from the hospital firewall, or some kind of a deal is made such that the vendors or developers will say, well, if we have any spin-off, if we make software, an algorithm in AI that is useful, we will let your hospital have it, or we will let the NHS have it, or whatever, at cost price, or whatever that may be. But it's also extremely interesting that in other parts of the world, in low and middle income countries, India, China and so forth, there is actually nothing stopping developers or vendors going out and purchasing data, you know, and that is what is happening actually.
Yes.
Huge amounts of, of chest x-rays, for example. So yes, I think, it is an area we need to be careful about.
Yes, and because the desire to have the cash from selling those images is so high, and then, but presumably do those countries then don't benefit from that and probably aren't able to buy the products or the tools or the systems that result on the back of it.
You can't develop a sound algorithm in AI without having large amounts of data, and those data, you have to have non-overlapping subsets of data to train the algorithm in the first place, to validate it and to test it, or else you retrofit the data and make a false algorithm. And I mean, who's to say that, for example, I don't know, some software that was developed to artificially to read or automatically to read, say, mammograms on patient women in, say, Tel Aviv, Israel, where some of these companies are based, for example, are going to work on women's breasts in Taunton, Somerset. It's by no means evident.
Yes.
I was actually judging a panel for Innovate UK today, with these large grants from the government awarded for innovation in medicine and for development of AI, as it happens. And we had a discussion about an algorithm that's being developed to recognise skin lesions. So not particularly my field, but by taking photographs of lesions and having those automatically analysed. And this particular work was being done in Scotland. Now, in Scotland, they will get certain types of skin diseases. They are less likely to get things like melanoma of the skin. There are fewer immigrants from overseas, from Afro-Caribbean origin or Indian origin or whatever. So there will be certain diseases that that population is not going to display particularly. And so if they take that algorithm and then, say, take it down to East London, it's not necessarily going to perform so well. It will need to be retrained.
And this has been a problem in medical data for a very long time, isn't it? With any data set, that what you put in will influence what you get out, and we assume a universality in what we put in based on the societal prejudices and biases of the time, which overlook certain sectors of society or disproportionately represent them without due acknowledgement of that.
We are talking about the greater good. We are talking about giving up our data, if you like, in an anonymised fashion to develop something that will serve the population at large.
Liz, did you want to?
Feels like it's been pretty comprehensively addressed.
Oh, okay.
But no, I mean, I guess the gold prospecting is interesting, and you can continue the metaphor because people talk about data mining and new forms of extraction. It's this, and that I guess to go back to your question, I can't remember who wrote that the history of medicine might be understood as a continuing attempt to make the body visible. So this, you know, and those things have always been subject to kind of economic interest, right?
Yes, yeah.
So I don't think the two things are so separable, which I guess is a point I'd like to make generally, is that I don't see medicine and art as being quite so separate as perhaps they're being kind of set up to be. You know, and a long time ago, they were much more interrelated, and I think that there are interesting questions about artists producing knowledge about the body as well as doctors producing knowledge about the body. So what's interesting in terms of, you know, some of the work that we've heard about tonight is how we might produce kind of new configurations, new understandings through the kinds of collaborations and conversations that are arising across disciplines now. So I would slightly challenge, I'm afraid, your model of the kind of the doctor does this and the artist does that. I think actually what's interesting is the overlap and the kind of generative possibilities in the middle. I'll say one more thing and then I'll finish, which I guess the thing that's happening now that's different is that the kind of data mining is global, and actually my data, your data, because we live now in kind of platform capitalism. You know, it can be shared, distributed in unlimited ways across the world in an instant, and that's different from Vesalius. Is that the right pronunciation?
I've heard Vesalius.
One's a volcano, I think.
It's
anyway,
a
that's my
form,
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Who knows? I think we might open this up to the audience, because I bet there might, if there are questions. If not, we can keep talking. But if anyone has a question, stick your hand up. Yes, there's one here. If you could wait for the microphone, and that way, hopefully, everyone can hear you.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that. I was really hoping we could go back to Ian's slides on the distinctions between clinical photography, or medical photography, and medical art, because it struck me that hello?
Yep.
Right, so the kind of medical art you're talking about doesn't really chime with the artistic practices of the three artists on the panel. So I was hoping we could get slides up and the three artists could have the kind of right to address that.
I guess that's what I was beginning to say. So maybe
I mean, I think that there's a thing here about terminology perhaps as well, that there's medical art and there's art that addresses medical issues. And they're quite different. There can be an overlap and they can be quite different. But maybe can we get the slides from the fourth speaker back up? We'll see if we can do that. And do any of our artists have Sophie, do you have a comment on that, the sort of where they do and don't meet?
Well, I think one's illustrative and one is more a reflection and a conversation. So, I mean, within my own, and I think sort of continuing also on from Liz's point about sort of authorship, I think it's really interesting how scientists and clinicians now are beginning to sort of really embrace having an artist as part of a research team. And I think there's something really interesting about the artist as the researcher, and that seeing an artist practice as having the same validity as a medical sort of practice. But there is still a sort of, I think, an imbalance of power, and there's a sort of, I think there's an urgency for artists' sort of voice to be given the sort of same equivalence that the scientific voice does. Through my practice, I don't cure somebody's life, but maybe through my practice, I can help bring a sort of quality of life to somebody and a reflection and a validation of their life that is different from society's understanding of what a normal life should be. So I think yes, I don't think, I'm not a medical artist, I'm an artist who reflects on the medical landscape, and I think there's quite a different sort of positioning around that.
Can I respond?
Yes, please do.
The purpose of separating it was not to sort of have it in kind of black and white in the way I might have presented it. For me, as a photographer, and also having spent quite a long time looking at the sort of the ethical nature of photography and indeed art, and the issues of privacy law and so on, and the right to one's own image, which we don't have in the UK, we've got to be careful whose interests. The issue is that if a patient or a person who is a patient, and that could be you or me, is not fully aware of what the program is or the process is or the connection, they can be seen just as an object and not a subject. And if we're not careful, we objectify medical conditions, human beings, for the sake of whatever it is. And there was a time in medicine where we were just objects. There was a time when consent was not part of the photographic landscape. When cameras started being put on phones, various doctors used to just take pictures of their patients without consent. And there are numerous accounts of that. Hospitals started to then introduce policies, and the current approach, and indeed the GMC guidelines, has its genesis from the 1980s, when policies in hospitals started to be generated. The GMC is very clear that whatever the record is for, whether it's a photograph, an audio recording, a video, some videoing, or an art form, consent has to be provided.
If the image is recognisable.
Well, you start with the patient, and that patient until that point is recognisable. If part of their anatomy is not recognisable, then then you can go forward and anonymise. But one of the things that photography departments used to do before digital imaging was we photographed a lot of X-rays. But before an X-ray could be published in a journal, we had to strip out from that image any identifying feature, including the name of the hospital. So
that's still the case.
And that's still the case. But it can be done digitally now and not longhand with negatives and setups that photograph X-rays.
Can I just chip in there with a question then? Because I think many of us would think, looking at an X-ray, that isn't identifiable.
That's true.
And
I mean, that's
so what's the line
so
there?
But it's
Okay, we'll have three comments. Sophie first.
one of the things I thought was very interesting is that when you displace a heart, which is somebody's heart that has they have a congenital heart disorder, and it's maybe not recognisable by the general public, but the surgeons and the medics will understand whose heart that is. And so it's a very niche audience, but people can interpret those models. So, I mean, that's one of the things that we've come into sort of during the project we sort of came into.
And that's an issue, just a quick, but that's an issue that comes up with data sets as well, isn't it, when you get to very specific conditions or combinations of factors. I said I'd let Nicola, and then and then.
No, I mean I agree with that. I mean the idea is that you know, if I wouldn't recognise my own liver, for example, or my own heart if it were made into a model. If there is a condition that is, of course, most of the congenital heart diseases are. I mean, they're rare, but then you know there are hundreds of them, thousands of them. So you actually wouldn't be able to see one total anomalous venous drainage and distinguish it from another. So, I mean, it's very important, obviously, to protect the privacy of the individual, and I would totally support that, but it would be very, very unusual to have a condition that was so unique, if you like, that there weren't any others in the world, and that would be recognisable. But yes, it's entirely proper to strip out any of the so-called DICOM headers, in other words, the demographics that are either burnt into the image or incorporated in a digital image, and that does include hospital numbers or addresses or dates of birth or whatever, and I think that's right and proper, and we should certainly support that. I would certainly support it. But I mean, if ever you're in any way concerned, then take consent from a patient if you can.
Just a quick point. So I think what's interesting is how the technology itself is making anonymization of images that much harder. So you can strip out all the identifiers, but you've got 683 image slices that you can reconstruct into a 3D form in an instant, and all sorts of things become visible in that reconstruction where you can see the body. I've been looking at all sorts of data sets which are officially anonymized. You can quite easily reconstruct those data sets into a 3D form where you can begin to see things that might be features within the body that could make somebody identifiable.
Yeah.
So it's getting more complicated.
Sophie, do you want? Amanda, do you want to chip in on this? Any of this up on the end?
I've just been printing livers, and I didn't think that would be something that would show difference, but they were all extraordinarily different from the same butcher. I presume then that they were probably from the same farm and probably from the same breed of sheep. I bought 12 in one day, so I presume they kind of came, but they were all extraordinarily different. So you would have, they were individuals. They showed the individual life of that animal. It's just that you wouldn't have necessarily been able to interpret that, or you interpreted it as you would. And as if I put my liver divination hat on, I would be able to tell whether, if I asked it a particular question, whether I'd get a positive or negative result for that. I know we're in a very different world now where that isn't what happens, but it has happened and people are still doing that around the world.
Yeah, I think I'm conscious of time. I think this is probably a good point to stop. I think this hits at a lot of the heart of the issues I was hoping to express in the exhibition and the events programme to go with it. So I'm really grateful to everyone for voicing your opinions. If people want to carry on discussing it, if they want to take issue with me for what I've included in the exhibition or left out, or if you want to chat to each other, or probably, I think our speakers, can you hang around for a bit if people want to talk to you afterwards, then please do. But I think we'll end it there with the tensions between the general and the individual, the anonymous and the identifiable. We don't know whose body it is, it's all of our bodies. And I guess we all have a role in making sure that our bodies are used in ways that we're happy with, and that any data we come into contact with is treated in the most appropriate ways we can manage. Just before we finish, some reminders. There is a cash bar downstairs. The exhibition is running for a bit more this evening and then carries on until the 3rd of April, and we have more events coming up throughout the series. We also have a new trail that takes you around the other museum collections here, showing you some other aspects of anatomy that are represented in the collections. I'd like to thank Stage Text. Absolutely. I'm going to try this microphone. Can we thank Stage Text? Thank you. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our 5 amazing speakers tonight: Sophie, Nicola, Liz, Ian, and Amanda. Thank you very much.